On February 25th, 2024, Aaron Bushnell walked in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. and apparently lit himself on fire, doused himself with a liquid, apparently gasoline, that he had in a metal drinking water bottle, and then lit himself on fire, self-immolated, died from those wounds, and was in obviously horrific pain, being lit on fire with gasoline, screaming "Free Palestine" while he was burning. And before he did it, he said some very important words, and that took place at 12:58 Eastern Time on Sunday, the 25th of February. And as of the 26th, so that's basically 1 in the afternoon on a Sunday. On Monday morning, the newspapers, you would think, would have on the front page a feature of this horrific protest, this attention-grabbing protest that would most certainly command readers' attention and most certainly deserves to be examined. What caused this young man to feel so deeply about what is going on in Palestine, the genocide, as he said in his video, in his statement, that he lit himself on fire in protest and died? So this happened at basically 1300, 1 p.m. Eastern Time on the 25th. So you would think that on Monday morning, the East Coast newspapers would have this on the front page, right? New York Times, Wall Street Journal, not on the front page at all. Here's the Wall Street Journal for the 26th of February, 2024. So they've had all afternoon on Sunday, all night to get their headlines ready, and they decide to go with "Kiev remains defiant after 2 years of war," and they're going to show a picture of the honored dead of Ukraine being honored. The neo-Nazi army of the Ukraine, the honored dead, that has Nazi insignia on their uniform, Nazi tattoos on their bodies. They're defiant after 2 years of war. That's your headline. Well, okay, maybe it didn't make the top page, top of the front page, or the biggest photograph on the front page, but certainly it's going to be on the front page somewhere, right? Well, have a look. Nowhere on the front page does Aaron Bushnell's act of self-immolation in protest to Israel's ongoing genocide and ethnic cleansing of Palestine, not just in Gaza, but now in the West Bank and expanding into Lebanon, bombing neighboring countries, enabled by the U.S. Nowhere in the entire front page of the Wall Street Journal, Monday, you can see the date right there at the very top, February 26, 2024, is this event that happened, very important event that happened on Sunday the 25th, mentioned on the front page of the next day's Wall Street Journal. And we'll see some additional footage that I took showing that it's not on their front page of their digital editions as well. But look, Peppa Pig, we've got an article down at the bottom. Peppa is a brat. Parents turn on the cheeky preschooler pig. So that story is so timely that had to run on the front page. You couldn't run Peppa Pig problems on a later date and somehow squeeze some room in there to talk about this self-immolation by an active duty serviceman of the United States Air Force burning himself to death in protest in front of the Israeli embassy because of the U.S.-enabled ongoing genocide of Gaza. Couldn't fit it in, but we've got Peppa Pig and other more important stories that we've got to run on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Now, I'm going to show some footage from, I'm here in Australia, so in Australia time, I'm taking footage of the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the front page of the New York Times. I'm taking that footage on the 27th at 10 a.m. and then again at 1400 or 2 p.m., which translates into 1800 and 2200 or 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. on the 26th. So here again, on the Monday after, I'm going to show you footage from the New York Times and from the Wall Street Journal, and neither of them, they're adding more stories throughout the day, but neither of them anywhere on the main page, the front page of the New York Times online or the Wall Street Journal online, do they see fit to mention this. So, look, I don't know the whole circumstances of this self-immolation. I don't know the backstory of Aaron Bushnell, and we're going to look at that a little bit in a moment. Just a little bit that I've been able to find out through no help of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. I don't know the full story of this event. I have seen the footage, but it's an important event, and it's very curious that the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are blacking it out completely, not talking about it. That leads me to believe that they don't know what to do with this event, and possibly it has something to do with this statement when Aaron Bushnell is walking up towards the Israeli embassy. He is filming himself. He's live streaming. They've taken down the live stream, but many people have captured it. He's live streaming, and he says these words: "I am an active duty member of the United States Air Force, and I will no longer be complicit in genocide. I will no longer be complicit in genocide." Okay, so he's in the Air Force. Obviously, as I've stated in many previous videos, Israel could not be doing what it is doing without being enabled by the United States. Israel does not have the munitions to sustain this kind of slaughter and these kinds of explosions for a single day without resupply from the United States, from the British Empire, from other countries. But this is a very telling statement. Aaron Bushnell says, "I will no longer be complicit in genocide." I was in the U.S. Army. I was an active duty Army officer for 11 years. After 4 years of West Point, 11 years I was an active duty officer. And I'm not sure that simply being in the Army or being in the Air Force equates to being complicit with what's going on in Israel any more than being a citizen of the United States, which is enabling this, is complicit. Now, the citizens of the United States are protesting, but they can't stop it. I'm a citizen in the United States. I can't stop it. I'm speaking out about it, but I'm not complicit. The criminals who are enabling these war crimes and this ethnic cleansing and this absolute genocide, it's not a war. The New York Times likes to call it the Israel-Hamas war. It's not a war between two combatants. It is absolute ethnic cleansing, war crimes, killing of civilians. But even so, it's not wrong to be in the Army or the Air Force of your nation. Nations do need armies to defend them and air forces to defend them. Russia needs an army, and there's nothing wrong with having an army if NATO keeps expanding up to your borders and putting secret CIA bases right on your borders, which also came out this week that was going on well before 2022. There's nothing illegal about having an army to defend yourself, and being in the army or being in the Air Force is not automatically immoral or complicit. So let's focus in on this statement. Aaron Bushnell says, I will no longer be complicit in genocide, which implies what? Somehow he feels that he is involved. Is the Air Force providing intelligence and targeting to Israel? Because Israel is getting intelligence and targeting from the British Empire, from the United States, from militaries and intelligence agencies of those entities. Criminally, I would add, it's criminal. So did Aaron Bushnell feel, because of some duty that he was performing wherever he was stationed in the Air Force, that he was somehow enabling the killing of these civilians? Is that why he's saying, I will no longer be complicit in genocide? Because like I said, being in the army doesn't equal enabling genocide. It can be done honorably to defend your country. But to set himself on fire indicates a very deep trauma going on inside this young man, where his entire identity is being crushed. Dr. Richard Schwartz, the founder of IFS, Internal Family Systems, a system that I talk about a lot in my most recent book, talks about the internal family and how parts of who we are will take on these defensive roles in order to protect the system. And they'll do things that seem self-destructive, but they see it as holding the system together, going on a big drinking bender in order to suppress the heartache and the pain of a childhood trauma, some deep betrayal by a parent or caregiver or someone you trusted and needed. That pain, when it resurfaces, can cause us to drink to drown it out, can cause a part to take over to try and put out that fire. And Dr. Richard Schwartz explains that suicide is the ultimate defensive part. It is actually a defense mechanism. When the identity of the system is so threatened, suicide can be a defense mechanism, because that part sees it as, this is the only way to hold the system together, to hold our identity. Our identity is so threatened, this is the ultimate defense of our identity. So somehow his identity, maybe he was idealistically believing that he was signing up to defend his country, and then he found himself providing targeting or intelligence, I don't know. In the Wall Street Journal, reporters, quote-unquote journalists, and the New York Times journalists aren't helping us to find out, but maybe he was so torn apart by, deep down, we all have a deeper self, a higher self. This is what the ancient myths talk about. This is what modern cutting-edge healers like Dr. Schwartz and Dr. Gabor Mate talk about. We have this deeper self, but trauma separates us from self. But self knows. Self inherently has compassion and connectedness to others. And it is quite possible that, I don't know the whole story about this. We don't know, and our quote-unquote journalists and the propaganda media of the West are not digging into it, at least in the United States. But it's quite possible that an idealistic young man who thought he was signing up to do one thing for idealistic purposes came up against the cold, hard, brutal truth of what he was doing and was feeling torn apart, and that's why he had to do this very extreme, horrific act in protest. It's a form of self-defense when the whole system is coming apart. It can be. It's extreme, but that is a possible explanation. But we're not getting any help from the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, because as I'll show you from the screenshots, there's absolutely nothing in the New York Times all the way as late as 1800, 6 p.m., and then again at 10 p.m. on the 26th. There's still nothing on the entire New York Times online page, front page, all the way down, or Wall Street Journal front page, all the way down. But let me add that suicide has been an absolute epidemic among the armed forces since the beginning of the so-called war on terror that was supposedly justified by the September 11th event, the September 11th incident. People who signed up thinking that terrorists brought down the World Trade Center and other buildings and then went over to fight terrorists found themselves doing something completely different. And obviously, in the light of ensuing years, we can see that the September 11th operation could not possibly be perpetrated the way that we were told that it was perpetrated. It was some kind of controlled demolition. It was not airplanes hitting buildings and causing them to pancake all the way down to where you could look right across the street and see all the way through them. So as early as 2011, the horrific numbers of suicides of veterans of the global war on terror led to the creation of this 22 push-up challenge. Of course, I remember the 22 push-up challenge because I was in the Army for 11 years and I went to West Point for 4 years before that. And I have lots and lots of friends who were in the Army still in 2011, 2016, when this 22 push-ups a day to try and bring attention to 22 suicides a day among veterans. 22 suicides a day. That is an epidemic. So what's going on when people in the military who are signing up because they're patriotic and they believe that they're doing something right for their country are coming face to face with what's actually going on? In many cases, 22 a day at one point. They are so distraught and torn apart that they're taking their own life. It's died down now, as if you can go read about this in various places online. When it went down to 20 a day, supposedly that was enough of an improvement to take some of the attention off of the 22 push-ups a day. But these words by Aaron Bushnell are haunting. He felt complicit in genocide, apparently. He was participating in something he knew was horrifically wrong. But the New York Times is not doing its job as supposedly the nation's paper of record, the journal of record. Could they be making the obvious analysis of that statement in the video and saying, what was he doing? Let me dig into it. I've got resources. I've got reporters. Let me go have a look. What was he doing? Nope. Dead silence. Dead silence. Let's take a look at a couple of those clips. So this is the New York Times. It was taken at, this screenshot was recording, the screen recording, you can see the date up top, Monday, February 26, 2024, today's paper. I recorded this at 10:26 a.m. in Australia on the 27th, so that translates to 18:26 on the 26th. So this is 6:30 in the evening. Nothing about this self-immolation here. We've got, what happens when someone who promoted body positivity loses weight? Yeah, we got to cover that. We've got this lady who gave $1 billion to provide free tuition at a Bronx medical school. Why do billionaires have to support that? That's something that the government should be providing. Oh, Steve Bannon. Let's focus on him. An unopened case of 10,000 hockey cards sold for $3.7 million. That's some asset price inflation. Nothing about this protest, self-immolation protest of an ongoing genocide by an active duty Air Force serviceman. Nothing. We're reaching the bottom here. World news, Middle East crisis, Israel, spy war. CIA secretly helped Ukraine fight Putin. CIA was putting bases on the borders of Russia long before 2022. That's important, but nothing about Aaron Bushnell. Oh, we do have Flacco the Owl. Flacco the Owl, he captured the imagination of New York Times readers. So that's important. Climate and environment. And EpiPens and inhalers aren't good for the environment. Like many a hero, here we have Flacco the Owl made his choice. Look, Aaron Bushnell gave his life protesting the ongoing genocide, and he doesn't want to be complicit in it. But we've got stories about everything but that. We got stories about Flacco the Owl. We got stories about influencers who lost weight. Oh, what does it mean to dress like an American? That's an important question. No, we've reached the end of the page. Nothing. At 10:26 Melbourne time on the 27th, which translates into 6:30 p.m., 6:26 p.m., 18:26 on the 26th. So all day long, we've had plenty of time to look into this story and ask some pertinent questions. Why did Aaron Bushnell say he didn't want to be complicit anymore? Do the American people want to know that? Does the supposed America's paper of record, New York Times hasn't been that for a long time, out and out propaganda, garbage, just garbage. Let's feature Steve Bannon. Let's feature billionaires. Let's feature Joe Biden with a helicopter. Nothing. Very, very noteworthy that the day after this happened, New York Times is not on top of this story because they don't know what to do with it. This is an international incident here. This is a big deal to the American people, but not according to the New York Times. Now let's take a look at the New York Times 4 hours later, almost 4 hours, 3.5 hours later. So here's another screen recording. They've obviously updated and refreshed some of these stories and added new ones. This is taken at 14:06 Melbourne time on the 27th. So that translates into 22:06. So the day has come to a close, the day after this self-immolation, and the New York Times cannot seem to find it important enough to put anything about this story on the front page. Look, they've updated it. Now we've got, when the census doesn't reflect you, we've got a new story on that. What box should I check? I'm so conflicted over what to check on the census. Look, I'm not belittling that as a story, but that's a story that could run next month. That's a story that could run in 6 months. This is an important international event. An immolation, apparently, of a serviceman who didn't want to be complicit in genocide. Do we want to get to the bottom of this or not? Nope. Nope. Not the New York Times. Oh, Flacco the Owl. We're gonna look into that. Ooh, there might have been something more than bad luck. Here's what we know. Let's look into Flacco the Owl. Look, I love animals and owls and nature. I'm not mocking that, but this is supposedly the nation's paper of record. This is propaganda. It's propaganda. A protest against Israel's genocide involving lighting oneself on fire does not merit attention anywhere on the entire landing page of the New York Times. You can scroll all the way down. You can find a story about how to make an Instagram-worthy wedding, but you can't find anything about an active duty Air Force serviceman lighting himself on fire in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. Does that strike anyone as odd? This is February 26th, Monday, February 26th, the day after it happened. We're not going to get anybody upset in the United States about this one. We got to focus on Flacco the Owl. What an absolute joke. All right, well, let's check out the Wall Street Journal. Let's see what they've got to offer us. Here we have the Wall Street Journal from 14:14 on the 27th, Australia time in Melbourne. So 14:14 on the 27th translates to 22:14 on the 26th. So again, this is Wall Street Journal at the end of the day, 26 February, that's Monday the 26th, the day after this very important protest happened. And don't think that, oh, well, just because the Wall Street Journal, they just want to focus on economics and business. No. If you go to their website, you'll see at the very top, they've got stuff about their 31-year-old reporter who was arrested in Russia for taking confidential material that Tucker Carlson kept saying, he's just a kid, 31-year-old kid. So obviously the Wall Street Journal gets involved in international politics, but in all kinds of other things. How Love is Blind helped Netflix crack the code. Sweden joins NATO. So it's not just business. But nothing. Tell me, can you find it here? How a former top pizza marketer is now promoting Jesus. Nope. Nothing about self-immolation of Air Force servicemen who does not want to be complicit in a genocide. That could be important. Look, Freddie Mercury's home in London selling, I guess, that's more important. We got to get that on there on the front page. Nothing. You can scroll through it. Tell me if you see it and I don't see it. It's not on here. We got the right-wing leader of Argentina and his dogs. That's a story that couldn't wait for a few days. So there you go. Now they did have it in their, they did have an article about it if you went to their mobile page, but this is the Wall Street Journal's front page, the entire page, nothing. Nothing. On their online edition. Maybe their mobile edition has something. But it's very odd that the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, the day after it happens, nothing. But the Daily Mail from Australia, it has a little bit more investigation of this horrific incident. You know, the United States is the most propagandized. The West is propagandized. Believe me, I live in Australia and I see the Australia papers, but the Australia newspaper here at least is reporting on it. Aaron Bushnell, 25, engineer who set himself on fire outside the Israeli embassy. It doesn't say to protest the ongoing genocide, but it does say that he was trying to get out of the Air Force, and it even uncovers some information that's very interesting. It says here that Bushnell is from Orleans, Massachusetts, and his father and mother are active in this Community of Jesus Church in Orleans, Massachusetts, previously characterized by CBC Radio Canada as a mysterious, quote, mysterious and abusive Christian cult. His father still has on his Facebook page links to this Community of Jesus Church in Orleans. This is very interesting. This is very important information. We've got connections to a cult, and not just any cult, one that is a mind control cult. Now look, I don't know what Aaron Bushnell's story was, why he joined the Air Force, what he was looking to find there, but it can be because you're looking for yourself. You submit to that kind of extreme environment because you're already looking for answers. You're looking actually for yourself. And that can also lead to, if you weren't brought up in an extreme religious environment, it can lead you to become extreme, as it did with me. I was searching for myself. I became extremely literalist. And so let's talk about this Community of Jesus from Orleans, Massachusetts. Here's from 2007. You can see on this blog, which is trying to expose religious cults, talking about some investigations into allegations of abuse at this Community of Jesus going all the way back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. There's an investigation of allegations of abuse in the 80s and 90s at a prep school that was associated with this Community of Jesus that's based in Orleans. And if you follow this, see, you can see that under investigation is a link. If you follow that over, you get to another article from 2007 talking about former students were routinely abused at this prep school that was associated with the Community of Jesus, and some of the teachers or priests, before they were priests, who were teaching at this school were abusing the young women there. It says routinely called sluts, whores, and Jezebels. And one former student, so this is Sheila O'Sullivan, that's a different student that was mentioned in the first article, Rosalind Price English, who was also saying that she was physically and verbally abused, mentally abused, and spiritually abused by the leaders in this cult-like church. A different young woman, Sheila O'Sullivan, wrote in a formal complaint that she was told by Mr. Farnsworth that she was nothing but a piece of meat, quote, nothing but a piece of meat. She said he questioned her inappropriately, licked her neck, and held her in his arms and told her she smelled good. That's obviously assault. That's assault. To put your arms around someone without their permission and sniff them and lick them is sexual assault. Okay? Now, I looked up, I found this article, Why Did I Endure? Why do people stay with cults like this? Carrie Buddington entered the Community of Jesus. She says, I entered the Community of Jesus, a New England religious community. This is the same one that's associated with the Bushnell family that his parents are closely involved with. His mother has worked for over a decade at their particular bookstore that puts out Community of Jesus literature, the Paraclete. That's another name. That's a Greek name for the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost, the Paraclete, the helper who comes alongside. So she works for Paraclete Books, and apparently Bushnell did some website work for Paraclete Books before he went off to the Air Force. He probably was doing it in high school because he was into computers and IT and websites and networking. Here's a woman who wrote an article called "Why Did I Endure? Why did I stay with this abusive community?" She says, "I entered with my husband in 1970 when I was 23 years old. We were newly converted Christians. We raised our 3 children there. My husband and children all left CJ, Community of Jesus, in the years between 1988 and 1995. I did not leave." And that's all we can see of the article. The website apparently is gone. You can't find it on Wayback Machine. You can't find it on a Google Cache. But Carrie Buddington, who wrote the article, wrote a book. Self-published book. I believe it came out in 2017 or pretty recently, in the last 5 or 6 years, called Exquisite Torture: Life in a Christian Cult, a memoir by Carrie Buddington. Obviously, I haven't read it. I just heard about this sect because of this Aaron Bushnell. No thanks to New York Times or Wall Street Journal. They haven't been digging into it at all. But Aaron Bushnell and his family are somehow associated with this cult. And Carrie Buddington was in it and felt trapped, and yet she wrote an article, "Why Did I Endure? Why Did I Stay?" And look on the cover of this book. I believe that's her. Here's the back of the book. There she is. You know, she was only 23 in 1970, but she joined this. She's with this older man. He's obviously in his 50s or something like that. She's obviously a very young woman. She's got her eyes closed and smiling, and this older man is obviously, he's got his arms around her. He's got his hand on her. He's touching her. He's got his shirt off. He's smiling. She's smiling, but this is obviously an inappropriate picture. She's putting it on the cover to let you know there's something wrong going on, but I stayed with it. I stayed in this cult. Why? Why didn't you just leave? It says on the back cover. And then the book is going to explain why she didn't just leave. Why don't people leave? And interestingly enough, I was going to talk about this very subject. I was planning this before this event even happened. And I was going to make a different video about why people stay. And I was listening to this account from a young woman who left an abusive cult, very abusive, and she explains she didn't leave, well, because they threatened to cut her off from her family, not let her see her family and children, and the Community of Jesus does the same thing. The CJs in Orleans, you can read some of the stuff online about them. They do the exact same kinds of tactics. But listen to this account where a young woman talks about she left, and then the pressure of what if I'm going to hell, and being cut off from the community got to her, and she went back for a while, and then later she left again. But listen to her explanation.
He's the best thing that's happened to me since I left the brethren, except my children.
Top of the big hill over there.
Laura left one night with the help of a friend. She got a job in a factory 100 miles away from her home in Portsmouth. But her parents traced her.
2 bottle and 2 dried, please. Yeah.
They spent ages talking to me and saying that if I didn't go back, they'd never be able to speak to me again, that I'd be condemned forever, and I was doing something really evil, all the things they normally say to try and make you go back. And I just said no. I had to be really strong, and it was really hard. And after they went, I was able to cry, but at the time I had to be really strong, because if they'd seen me weak, they would have been able to play on that and take me home. I think I got really that lonely that I started missing my family, and then the doubts started to creep in. Well, what if they're right? What if I do end up going to hell? I don't want to burn forever in hell, and all that sort of thing. And that actually eventually made me go back.
Now, I would argue that that threat of excommunication, you're not going to, our friendship and our love and our familial relationship is conditional. If you don't believe what we believe and do what we tell you to do, we're going to cut you off. And if that's not good enough, we're also going to threaten you with eternal damnation and suffering after death. And you might think, oh, that's just these cults. That's just these extreme religious fringe groups. No, it's not. This is one of the biggest churches in Australia. This is their website. I took this picture today. We believe that our eternal destination of either heaven or hell, eternal destination, you're either going to eternally end up in heaven or hell, is determined by our response to the Lord Jesus Christ. So your response to a supposed flesh and blood Jesus Christ is going to determine whether you eternally end up with the destination of heaven or the eternal destination of hell, suffering, hellfire, eternally. Here's one of the biggest mega churches in the United States, in Fort Lauderdale. We believe a person's eternal destiny is determined by believing in or rejecting Jesus Christ and his sacrificial death on the cross. Obviously, they're talking about a literal flesh and blood Jesus on a literal wood physical cross. They're saying if you don't believe in that, if you reject that, that's going to determine your eternal destiny. Those who believe are forgiven of their sins and receive the gift of eternal life with God in heaven. They get a little more explicit than the previous website. Those who reject this will be judged for their sin by experiencing eternal separation from God in hell, a literal place of suffering. And then they've got some Bible verses for you to misinterpret there to try and support their misinterpretation of a literal hell. They're literally wrong. They're taking it wrong, and we'll show you that in a minute. We'll see evidence of that in a moment. I'll just go through a couple more examples. Western Roman Catholicism, of course, also teaches this same concept of an eternal hellfire, and we can see that in a couple of examples that I will put up on the screen from a Roman Catholic website. This is Catholic Answers, and it's talking about hell, arguing that the early church believed in a literal hell. This article says that doctrine of hell is so frightening that numerous heretical sects end up denying the reality of an eternal hell. They describe denial of hell or modification of hell into something that's not permanent, because they mention, for instance, Latter-day Saints or Mormons. They do believe in a hell, but it's not eternal, it's temporary in their teaching. I'm not going to go into every single permutation here, but they call anyone who doesn't believe in an eternal hell a heretic, and they say if you deny hell, literal or eternal, that's a decay. It's a decayed doctrine or teaching. Your teaching has crumbled into decay. It's rotten if you don't believe in an eternal punishment in hell. That's off of this website, Catholic Answers, and another article on Catholic Answers called What is Hell? And you can read the subtitle, Hell is Real, Hell is Eternal, and the Bible is full of proof that it exists and that people are in it. So obviously a very literal hell is being taught here. I will say that the Eastern Church, the Orthodox churches, that there was a schism with the Western Roman Church, they do have a much more sophisticated and nuanced view of these concepts of heaven and hell. They do not actually see it as a place, a literal place. But they're still taking a literal approach to Jesus and the disciples. They teach in a quite clearly a flesh and blood Jesus. So I'm not going to get into all of the different nuances here, but I'm simply showing that literalism, which is mistaken, especially in the West, Roman Catholicism and then the Protestant spin-offs in all their different permutations, tend to teach a literal hell. This is still a major issue. We saw it in that clip of the young woman from the 2002 documentary who had tried to leave an abusive, extreme, controlling cult, and she went back in large part because she asked herself, well, what if hell is real? What if I'm making a big mistake? That's why I'm making this video, for people who have that doubt, have that nagging fear. What if I'm wrong and hell really is a place and I am facing eternal damnation in a literal hellfire, which is still taught, as we just saw, by Roman Catholicism, by some of the biggest churches in Protestantism, and still weighs heavily on people's consciences and fears when, let's say, someone comes to your door and you close the door and you say, look, I'm not interested in that message, but then you turn around and you go back to your house, your home, your family room, whatever, you sit down and you start to think, ooh, what if they're right? What if they're really right? This threat of eternal hellfire, why am I connecting it in with this self-immolation? Well, I'll try and tie it all together at the end, but if people start not being afraid to die when there's oppression, genocide, and criminality going on, the resort of, well, if you're not afraid to die, you should be, because you're going to spend eternity in hell. The controlling, trauma-inducing system of this world, this literalist Christian worldly, the exclusive brethren like to use the term worldly to describe people who are not part of their particular exclusive sect. But really, this is a world-conquering, oppressive system. The literalist Christian cult, when it took over these ancient scriptures, which are esoteric, we'll get to that in a moment, it inverted their esoteric message, and then it went on a rampage, spreading out across Europe, across northern Africa, eventually up into northern Europe and Scandinavia, what's today called Scandinavia, and then started to jump the ocean and go over to the Americas, converting people, destroying their received traditions, their sacred traditions, and imposing this system, which is very much a system to help sustain this economic oligarchy, serfdom, that's still going on. It is a worldly system. It is the system of worldly oppression, and it enables oligarchy, and it keeps the people from overthrowing or prosecuting, bringing those oligarchs to justice, not just because the oligarchs have armies and they had armor and horses back in the Middle Ages, and today they've got other physical forces, but they also use the mind control of, well, you better think about your eternal soul. If you go against the church, you could perish in hell and experience hellfire forever. Let me just say, in that brief description of the spread of literalist Christianity, just remember, nobody's ancestors originally were literalist Christians. The literalist Christian faith spread by conquest and violent threat of you either get baptized or you'll die. So nobody's ancestors, if you go back far enough, were literalist Christians. China was not Christian. Japan was not Christian. Korea was not Christian. Europe was not Christian. Africa was not Christian. The Americas were not Christian. The Pacific Islands were not Christian. Australia and New Zealand were not Christian. Literalism is an imposed faith, and it uses this threat of eternal hellfire as a weapon in its arsenal. And so now let's look at some evidence. The reason I'm making this video is because I have evidence that can help assuage those fears if you have been browbeaten, threatened with eternal damnation and hellfire. That threat is not just used in what we think of as extreme cults that remove themselves from the world. Some of the very biggest literalist Christian churches teaching a flesh and blood Jesus make it quite clear on their websites that they teach, if you don't accept our stories about a literal flesh and blood Jesus and the significance that we tell you about this Jesus and those stories, if you don't interpret them our way, then you're going to have an eternal destination that involves eternal hellfire and damnation and suffering forever. No way out. So let's go back to the writings of the Reverend Robert Taylor. I don't always agree with Robert Taylor, but he has written a lot about this subject. And I want to start off, he's looking at this story, the rich man and Lazarus. Now, when I was in the literalist Christian church, I heard preachers say, oh, this one's not a parable, because in the parables, the characters don't have a actual name. They're called such and such a man, or, this man, that young, the young foolish virgins who don't trim the wicks of their lanterns. They don't get names, but in the rich man and Lazarus, Jesus must be talking about an actual rich man and Lazarus, and after they die, Jesus is letting us in on the condition of the rich man. He's suffering in hell, and Lazarus goes up to the bosom of Abraham, and even though Lazarus was a poor beggar lying outside of the gate during life, he is exalted in heaven after death, whereas the rich man goes down to hell and torment and begs Lazarus, oh, could I just get a drop of water, maybe just off your fingertip? Would you just dip down a little water to me? And he gets the answer, sorry, even if I wanted to, I can't. There's an immeasurable gulf between heaven and hell, and you can't bridge it. There's no way to get across. There's no way for me to even slack your thirst with a few drops of water down there in hell. I'm sorry. So Robert Taylor says, let's take a look at this story. It's obviously a celestial parable. It's obviously celestial metaphor. This is obviously esoteric teaching, and you're making a big mistake if you take it literally. But he says this this is super useful for those literalist Christians, and he indulges in some of Robert Taylor had a very biting, cutting sarcasm, and man, he was vicious. And he's saying, look, there's no part of the gospel more instructive as to the nature and character of the divine revelation, and more congenial to the dispositions and tempers which genuine Christianity inspires, than this true story of the rich man and Lazarus. He's being sarcastic here in case you don't know. These are actually written down transcripts of his lectures. This is from a collection called astronomico-theological lectures. They were actually published after the death of Robert Taylor, but they're from his actual sermons. This was a sermon that he delivered, or a lecture that he delivered, and you can just hear him if you listen and understand that this is sarcasm. He's saying, oh, this story, this is the best one for really seeing the genuine Christian character. A good Christian, as the Reverend Mr. Simeon of Cambridge says, obviously a colleague. Robert Taylor was thrown out of the Church of England for teaching that the Bible is based on the stars, basically. He was also imprisoned for teaching that. So he's saying, look, let me point you out to a good Christian I know, the Reverend Simeon, Mr. Simeon of Cambridge. He says a good Christian would not be without the fear of hell if he might. Even if you could live your life without the fear of hell, a good Christian wouldn't want to do that. A good Christian needs that fear of hell all the time. Even if you could get rid of it, you don't want to. It is a wholesome fear. It is a salutary fear, a healthy fear, calculated to prevent their backsliding and to make them press forward with the more earnestness and zeal in their progress towards Zion, with their faces thitherward. So you don't want to get rid of the doctrine of hell, even if you could, because it induces a nice healthy fear in everybody to keep them from backsliding and make them press forward. So he's being ultra sarcastic here. And then he says, and even when, through the consolations of God's Holy Spirit, Christians sometimes rise superior to this fear for themselves, there is still a peculiar pleasure and unspeakable gratification in contemplating the just judgment of God as still impending over the children of disobedience. So, look, like I said, I don't agree with Robert Taylor 100% on anything. He was a very insightful analyst of connections to the constellations. Even there, I don't agree with him all the time, but obviously I'm going to make use of some of his arguments here. I'm not going to go fully and, spend a whole nother hour showing that heaven and hell are celestial metaphor, but I will show some proofs. But what I'm pointing out is that Robert Taylor perceived the very same thing that I'm talking about. Hell is a doctrine that can be used to prevent backsliding. And it's no laughing matter, as we saw with that young woman who tried to leave an absolutely trauma-inducing, mentally abusive cult. And she did leave, but she went back, basically went crawling back, and was permitted herself to be shut up in a house by herself, basically solitary confinement, for 5 months in order to get back into the good graces of the priests or the leaders running this cult. That was part of the discipline that they enforced on her. She went back, as we just heard, by her own admission, because of a fear of hellfire. What if I'm wrong? What if leaving really does expose me to eternal damnation? And so Robert Taylor's being sarcastic and bitingly funny here, viciously funny, but it's not a laughing matter, and he knows it's not. He's saying, look, this is used to keep you pushing forward and to keep you in line. And I've actually heard another reverend, I used to be a reverend, the Reverend Robert Taylor, before they kicked me out. I've heard another reverend say, a good Christian wouldn't do without this doctrine even if he could. And now Robert Taylor's saying, and if you somehow do get over that fear, because through the Holy Spirit you know you're going to heaven, then it creates an even worse problem, a smugness and a kind of self-congratulation as you look around at those who are going to hell. He says, even if some Christians sometimes rise above this fear, there's this peculiar pleasure, and he's not saying this is a good thing. He's obviously saying this is a terrible thing, this is psychotic, a peculiar pleasure and unspeakable gratification in contemplating the just judgment of God that's still hanging over the heads of the children of disobedience. So enough there to show that Robert Taylor understands the use of hell as a kind of a mental trauma to control people. And in a lecture where he looks at the identity of Abraham, remember in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, Jesus actually describes the beggar Lazarus who's lying outside of the gate. That's celestial. We'll take a look at the stars in a minute. Going up to the bosom of Abraham. And so in his lecture on Abraham, Robert Taylor says, it's important to note that Abraham comes from Ur of the Chaldees, the Chaldeans. He says, these stories come from the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans were stargazers. They were star worshipers. They were into the stars. And if these stories were then taken from the Chaldeans and wrongly turned into supposed literal history, if there were people who took these Chaldean stories as literal history, they're wrong. He's saying, without caring to acquaint themselves with the astronomical significancy, they adopted the veil of an occult science as a tissue of real history. They took an occult esoteric system of metaphor based on the stars. Astronomical significancy means astronomical metaphor, celestial metaphor, and they reduced it to a tissue of supposed history, flesh and blood people, and pretended that that history was peculiarly their own. Oh, I must be descended from all these figures in these stories. And Robert Taylor says, wrong. And guess what? That's just what Aaron Bushnell was protesting with this self-immolation, which we don't know that much about. It only happened a little over 24 hours ago. But he's protesting a genocide that is based on the idea that people are literally descended from the children of Israel, and therefore that land belongs to them, and that there's no such thing as settler colonialism because they're just coming back to their own land. It's mind control in order to excuse abuse, just like mind control in order to keep people in these abusive situations. Why didn't you ever leave? Well, there's the threat of hell. Now, Robert Taylor's going to say, listen, we can see that Abraham cannot be taken for a real personage. He's not a flesh and blood human. He's addressed by the rich man in hell who lifts up his eyes and sees Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. But in this part that I've circled here, Robert Taylor points out, and I have a whole video about this, and I talk about it in some of my online courses, Paul, in his letters, explains very bluntly the story of Abraham with his two wives is an allegory. When you have two mothers of two different children, that's an allegory for our own nature. We have a higher self and a lower self, or a lower nature. That's what's being talked about. It's a metaphor. It's a esoteric teaching. These things are an allegory. That story where it's written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman, which things are an allegory. Robert Taylor says, if Abraham and his two wives are an allegory, then this story about Lazarus going up to the bosom of Abraham, allegory. Now, I'm going to give you some celestial interpretation of my own. This is beyond what Robert Taylor says about this particular story, but he perceives quite correctly that this is celestial metaphor. Now I'm going to show you that Abraham is associated with a specific constellation in the sky, Hercules. And I go into this in much greater depth in my online course, the Celestial Bible Tour, Part 1. I talk about where Abraham meets Melchizedek, and who is Melchizedek and who is Abraham, or at that time Abram, before he has his name changed to Abraham. These are some pictures of Abraham meeting with the three angelic visitors. Now, in each case, notice Abraham is in this deep lunge posture or kneeling posture. I have reversed the top painting, but these are historical paintings. Abraham kneeling before the three angelic visitors can be shown to be associated with the constellation Hercules, at least in this instance, and also when he meets with Melchizedek. Who could be Melchizedek, who brings forth bread and wine? Who could be the triple angelic visitor? That would be the constellation Ophiuchus. I have shown that Ophiuchus plays angels in the book of the Revelation. There's a specific passage in Revelation 10 where an angel is described sounding a trumpet, having one foot, the right foot in the sea and the other foot on the land. If you look at this constellation Ophiuchus, you will see that one foot is in the Milky Way, one foot is not in the Milky Way. Angels are very often associated with Ophiuchus. You can see why the angelic visitor would sometimes be a triple visitor, because Ophiuchus is a triple-bodied constellation. There's that central body and then the two serpent halves. That is Melchizedek. I talk about it in my online course and give proofs. Abraham in this instance is associated with Hercules. When Lazarus goes up to the bosom of Abraham, Lazarus, when he's lying outside the gate, he's a different constellation. Ophiuchus can also look like a gate. I hope you can see that. A portal, a doorway. Could be also a mountain, a mound. Ophiuchus plays a lot of different figures, but they all make sense based on the constellation. The figure lying outside the gate, we'll see that in a moment. But when he does get raised up to the bosom of Abraham, Lazarus is Ophiuchus. And what's interesting is Robert Taylor has pointed out that the very name Lazarus is related to ancient Egyptian god named Azar. Azar. El, the god Azar, becomes a Lazarus. Azar is the Egyptian name for Osiris. Osiris is a Greek version of the Egyptian word Azar. For the god Azar, the Greeks turned it into Osiris. You can see that that's a Greek-sounding name, Osiris. Lazarus is associated with Ophiuchus, and I have shown in my book, Ancient Worldwide System, Osiris is indeed associated with Ophiuchus. I know you've heard that Osiris is associated with Orion. I give my full arguments in that book why Osiris is also, and probably more so, associated with Ophiuchus. But in any case, Osiris, who's a dying god, goes down to the underworld and then is raised up again. Lazarus, he goes down into the tomb and is raised up again. And then there's also the different episode of Jesus and Lazarus, his friend Lazarus. I don't think that's the same Lazarus, but these aren't literal flesh and blood people. These are stories based on the stars, and Ophiuchus is Lazarus. He goes up to the bosom of Abraham. Now, Robert Taylor also explains that the whole concept of hell has to do with the turning of the cycles of heaven. Every night we have darkness, and then in the morning we have daylight. And as we go through the year, we have months where darkness prevails and night is longer than daytime. And then we have months where daytime prevails and daylight is longer than hours of darkness. And that cycle alternates throughout the year, just like night and day. We alternate between light and dark every day. We also alternate throughout the year between months where light dominates and months where dark dominates. And in his astrotheological lectures, where Robert Taylor talks about the identity of the devil, which also relates to his arguments about the celestial and esoteric concept of hell, Robert Taylor says, listen, there's not a single allusion to the character of the devil, Satan, in either the Old or New Testament, but what bears an astronomical sense and will bear no other. There's no description of the devil that isn't celestial, that you can't interpret celestially, and in fact, you can't interpret it any other way than celestially. He says the prince of darkness, of course, is the adversary of the prince of light, and so this has to do with the tension between light and dark, and that's why we talk about the powers of darkness, the bottomless pit down in the dark, and he says it literally is bottomless, meaning when we're turned towards the darkness of night, we're looking out into infinite space towards which the earth presents its adverse or diabolical surface. The adversary, the adverse side of the earth, the part that's not turned towards the sun, is looking out into space, out into the bottomless pit of space. That's what he says. This is where you get all these concepts of hell. He says, the angel of the bottomless pit, of whom St. John in the 9th of the Revelation tells us, I've done several videos about Revelation chapter 9, the angel who opens up the keys to the bottomless pit, and then the smoke arises from the bottomless pit, and then there's a description of scorpions or horsemen with tails like scorpions. It's all based on the rising of the Milky Way in between the constellations Sagittarius and Scorpio. So back to Robert Taylor, he says it's the angel of the bottomless pit of whom St. John in the 9th of the Revelation, 9th chapter, tells us that he was king over the scorpions, or angels that were like scorpions and that had tails like unto scorpions, and there were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men 5 months. Now there is the scorpion. Robert Taylor's saying this in an actual lecture. He must be pointing to a globe. We just saw Hercules and Ophiuchus. Down below the feet of Ophiuchus is the constellation Scorpio. Now there is the scorpion. That scorpion is located by the smoke that ariseth from the bottomless pit. What is the smoke that Scorpio is immersed in, the smoke of the bottomless pit? That is the Milky Way. The Milky Way is that very bright band, and the brightest part happens to be the part that goes right up through the body of Scorpio, right up past Ophiuchus. You can see it. I'll actually highlight it for you in light blue, and then I'll take it away. That's the Milky Way. Scorpio is in the Milky Way. Now there is the scorpion in the gates of hell. Ophiuchus looks like a gate. Remember, Lazarus in his lifetime was a beggar lying at the gate. It's probably Scorpio. Then he got raised up to the bosom of Abraham. But now there is the scorpion. That is the genius of October. Scorpio is in the path of the ecliptic that the sun and the moon and the planets pass through. And he's saying, look, the sun passes through Scorpio during the month of October, when it's descending down towards the December solstice, the lowest point, that depth going down. When the sun goes down into October, we're going to have 5 more months before we get out of the lower half of the year. He says, count, if you please, the 5 that are under him. So what's he talking about? This is a zodiac wheel. This shows the path of the sun throughout the year. And the way this zodiac wheel from the early 1600s is laid out, the path of the sun, the constellations, the background stars are arranged in a clockwise fashion. The sun plunges down into the lower half of the year, right at the start of that long arrow, that plunge downward at that red X, plunging down to the lower half of the year. That's the fall equinox after Virgo. You can see the sign of Virgo there. Plunging down between Virgo and Libra and moving down towards the lower half of the year, heading down towards the winter solstice for the northern hemisphere, the December solstice. And down there, I've put a number 1 next to Scorpio. So after crossing downward, passing Libra, you get to Scorpio. And he says in his lecture up above in that box, the red box, at the bottom of that red box, Robert Taylor says, count, if you please, the 5 that are under him, or over which he reigns. He's referring back to the 9th chapter of Revelation, where there are scorpion men or scorpion monsters with scorpion tails who have power to hurt men for 5 months. And he's saying, why 5 months? Well, let's count from Scorpio. 1, he says, count, if you please, from Scorpio, and let's see how many months before we get out of the lower half of the year. 1, 2, that's Sagittarius there by the 2. 3, that's Capricorn. 4 is Aquarius. 5 is Pisces. And then we get out of that lower half of the year. He says, the 5 that are under him, over which he reigns, October, November, December, January, February, and there in March, Robert Taylor says in his lecture, behold, the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. After going through the lower half of the year, you finally make it to the upper half of the year at the sign of Aries, the ram. This is in the age of Aries. This particular celestial metaphor is using the age of Aries, and the lower half of the year, that's when we're plunged down into the lower half. That's when we're in this body. The lower half of the year is when we're in a human body, in this system. We're incarnate. We're down here suffering all the stings of the scorpion in this physical existence. That's what that lower half of the year is actually talking about. It's not talking about a hell after you die. It's actually where we are right now. Where we are right now. We're down here in the lower half. We're doing this lower crossing. We plunge down with the first birth at the fall equinox in this esoteric system. And we go down in the very bottom of the year, right down before we get to that turning point and the second birth, the spiritual birth. That's where we encounter Scorpio and we're getting down to the lowest part. And elsewhere, I think Robert Taylor talks about this verse, but I put it up here in one of the Gospels, Mark chapter 9. Jesus is talking about that lower place, that place of torment. He says, where their worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched. What is Jesus talking about? The worm that dieth not is Scorpio. The fire that is not quenched is the Milky Way, the fire or the smoke from the bottomless pit. The Milky Way can play different things in different myths. Sometimes it is a river, but very often it is a fiery column or a smoke rising up from the fire of the bottomless pit. That's where the fire is not quenched. That's where the worm dieth not. So hell is a metaphor. All of the celestial myths, the ancient star myths, are metaphors. They are teaching us information we need in this life about our current situation. The very word hell, in fact, comes from the name of a goddess, a rather monstrous goddess in the Norse myths. In the Gylfaginning, the beguiling of Gylfi, the god Odin, speaking in disguise, says of hell, her hall is called sleet cold, her dish hunger, famine is her knife, idler her thrall, sloven her maidservant, pit of stumbling her threshold by which one enters, disease her bed, gleaming bale her bed hangings. She is half blue-black and half flesh color, by which she is easily recognized, and very lowering and fierce. So, in the realm of hell, you encounter sleet cold. Well, guess what? In the Norse realms of Scandinavia, you encounter cold winters. This is talking about all the conditions of this world. Her dish is called hunger. Famine is her knife. These are conditions of this realm. There's idlers and slovenliness and stumbling and disease. Her bed is known as disease. Those are afflictions of this realm. You didn't end up in the realm of hell in the Norse mythology unless you died of either old age or sickness. The goal was for a warrior to die in battle so he could go to Valhalla, the hall of the valiant ones, the hall of the valiant warriors who died in battle, where they would feast in Odin's hall, Valhalla, drink mead every night and eat delicious roast pork every night, and the next day they would go out, fight each other and cut each other up, and then be miraculously healed and put back together and go party up again. So it was all partying, fighting, and even if you got your arms and head cut off, you just put it back on and you were good to go for the party that night and the feasting that night and the beer drinking that night. You didn't want to die what they called a straw death, not in battle. Now, do I believe that these myths are literal? I talked about this in my book on the Norse myths. This is not talking about literally dying in battle, or else you won't go to Valhalla. Literally dying in battle, or else you'll end up in the realm of hell. The realm of hell is this realm. But what are the Norse myths saying? We're supposed to fight. We're supposed to battle without worrying if we die in battle. We're supposed to engage in the fight. And I'm bringing this back to Aaron Bushnell. I don't really know all the details of this self-immolation. All I've seen is this one video. Okay, but I did see the video, and it's graphic, and it's painful to watch. But whatever the backstory is, he was engaged in the fight, extremely passionate about the injustice and the horrific genocide that's going on right now, and he decided to protest that. Now, I'm not saying that literally we all have to do that same thing. We don't literally all have to go die in battle in order to get into Valhalla. But what is this talking about? You have to engage in the struggle, or you're going to end up right back here in this life again, in the realm of hell, back on the realm of cold and hunger and disease and stumbling. Don't do that. You got to go engage in the struggle. Do what's right. I'm not saying we all have to go literally die in battle. I'm not saying that's what the Norse myths were talking about. These myths are all esoteric, but they're telling us to engage in the battle. Not that long ago, I did a video about Arjun not wanting to get into the battle of Kurukshetra, even though he was totally equipped to win that battle. He wanted to just sit it out. And Krishna says, no, Arjun, let me tell you the Bhagavad Gita. Let me give you the song of Krishna to tell you you've got to go engage in that battle. So, to conclude, this threat of a literal hell is frequently used to traumatize us, to try and use mind control to traumatize people, to keep them in these abusive cults. But trauma can also be inflicted on entire populaces, and that's exactly what literalist Christianity has used, the threat of eternal hellfire and other trauma-inducing systems, including the deliberate abuse and rape of children. Trauma can be inflicted and is being inflicted on entire populations, and in fact on the entire world, in order to keep us in situations that we shouldn't be kept in, and using the threat of hell or other literalistic doctrines to impose that. And this whole horrific genocide that's being inflicted on Gaza is also being done in the name of literalistic misinterpretation of the Bible, in the personage of Abraham, and all the way down the line. So we have to engage in the struggle. I'm not saying that we have to literally do anything like what Aaron Bushnell did in terms of self-immolation, but we have to stand up against the trauma, speak out against the trauma, and together we can put a stop to this madness.